From wherever you are in the world today. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And I'm really delighted. I'm really delighted to bring in our final keynote speaker, who is Heather Beach. So Heather, if you'd like to turn your video on and say hello. Heather is a single mum to 16-year-old Rosie and is founder of Healthy Work Company, an ex-director for a global company where she ran their health and safety businesses, publishing magazines, running conferences and information services. She now runs the Healthy Work Company, working with businesses such as Biffa, Mace, Eurostar, ITV, The Telegraph, Battersea Power Station, IOPC, Games, Sonico and Luton Airport to support wellbeing strategies and influencing skills for HSE teams. With a postgraduate certificate in applied positive psychology and relational organisation, she was also recently certified in implementation of ISO 45001 and was voted in the top 10 most influential people in health and safety for the third year running in 2021. Heather has also been featured on TV, which is great, and he's out and about. And Heather, I was really delighted to meet you at Brussels recently. So we've been working together and referring to each other. And of course, you're very involved with the Women in Safety UK network as well, so very good friend to OneWISH and a member of OneWIsh. So it's been brilliant to meet you recently, and it's great to have you here as our final speaker. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Heather. We are monitoring the live stream LinkedIn's site for your questions. If you're looking at this through Zoom, do put your questions in the chat box, and I will be posing those to Heather a bit later on in the session. So Heather, over to you.
Oh, hello, Louise. I'm so happy to be here with you today. Fantastic work that OneWIsh is doing, and especially important to be doing this in Stress Awareness Week. And I've been really struck over the last week or so by conversations I've been having with mostly health and safety professionals who are just saying there is no slack in the system. It's really tough to keep prioritizing, reprioritizing and avoiding stress and burnout. It's a really tricky time for all of us because life is so much more uncertain than it was as well. When we first started running these courses, it was obviously during a global pandemic when there was lockdown and all of those sorts of things. And now we're also dealing with, war in Ukraine. We're dealing with a cost of living crisis. So these challenges are not going away. So this last presentation for OneWIsh today, it's very much about us as individuals. So in the Healthy Work Company, we look at organizational well-being, which is things like stress risk assessments, ISO 45003, manager training, that sort of thing. But we also look at personal resilience. So this one is very much for you personally as health and safety professionals to think about yourselves, your priorities, and really kind of start to look at how you can manage life yourself better to ensure that you don't head down the route of too much stress and burnout. So obviously we've had the introduction to me. Right, I am going to use the chat box here. If you would like to pop in the chat box, please feel free. It would be great to hear from some of you during this presentation today. What is the one non-negotiable for your well-being? So what is it that makes the most enormous difference to you that you have to really make sure that you focus on and do? So for me, whilst you're popping stuff in the chat box, and hopefully one or two of you will, it's sleep. So I have to have 7 hours at least sleep a night. Otherwise, I am not a nice person. And when I haven't had my 7 hours sleep, also I eat bad stuff. I don't want to exercise. My thinking goes all over the place. I start to catastrophize. So for me, it's all about sleep. There are many other things that I have to kind of keep control of my well-being too, but it's sleep is the main one for me. So Louisa said, time with people I love, family or friends. Absolutely brilliant, Louisa. I totally agree. Connection is so important. We're going to be looking at that as well. And Dee agrees with me. Sleep, sleep, and more sleep. So it's just important that we think about this. When we first started the business 5 or 6 years ago, and I used to stand in front of groups of people and say, do you plan for your well-being? Do you plan for your happiness? People used to look at me as if I was a bit mad. And a couple of people actually said to me, well, that's a bit sad, isn't it, if you've got to plan for these things, as if they're supposed to happen naturally, and if they don't happen naturally, there's something inauthentic about it. But if the global pandemic has taught us anything, it's the fact that we do have to plan for it. Otherwise we land up on the hamster wheel and we're not actually really thinking about what we're doing, where we're focusing, where we're putting our priorities, and we have to be much more proactive about it. Oh, that's lovely. Christina has said her faith. That's really interesting. Spirituality is a huge one for many people. And then Louise, for you, it's friends. That's lovely. That's really lovely. And you're a great hugger in person, I may say, Louise. So let's have a look at the impact of COVID-19. So you will obviously be aware that there was a huge increase in prevalence of anxiety and depression worldwide during COVID. And we've got factors of such as loneliness, fear of infection, suffering and death for oneself and loved ones, grief, financial worries have also all been cited as stressors. Now, what's interesting, though, is that University College London did a wonderful study over the 2-year period where people were in lockdown, coming out of lockdown. And they actually noted that many parts of the population had shown resilience. So they'd come out of COVID and they were kind of tentatively feeling better, feeling more resilient. You know, the anxiety levels had retreated, apart from certain demographics. So the demographics which were really struggling were young people. So 15 to 24-year-olds really struggling still. Ethnic minorities often, those that experience stigma and discrimination. So those with socioeconomic issues, you know, those that don't have as much money. And obviously, even since they did that study, we've had the cost of living crisis, which is really making a lot of people struggle with their mental health as well. So all in all, we are in a period of uncertainty, of difficulty, where we as humans need to learn far more about how our brains work, how we work effectively, you know, be self-aware about ourselves as well, and try to think about how we can mitigate for some of these things. Look, this is a reminder. I'm sure that many of you have already attended a general mental health awareness course of some sort, and you will know something about the mental health continuum. But I'm bringing it out here because it's so important to understand. So we see on the right-hand side of there the fact that we aim to be flourishing. So flourishing has implications of growing, of developing, of being positive about the future, of feeling happy as well, feeling content, feeling positive about things. And we're not always in that place. Sometimes we've got moderate mental health. So, you know, we're okay. We're not great. We're getting along all right. But lots of the population have been languishing. So languishing might look like not getting enough sleep. It might look like not feeling so great. It might feel like ruminating. It might feel like thinking about something and then creating a chain of catastrophe. It might look like not eating properly. And if we continue in that vein for a lengthy period of time, we can end up going to the doctor and being diagnosed with a mental illness. And then it can take quite a long time for us to move back up to flourishing, because there aren't necessarily obvious treatment paths for everything. Yes, there's evidence base around some treatments working better for certain mental illnesses than others, but it can take a while to work your way back up through to flourishing. So, and then we might be flourishing with a mental illness, or we might be just back to flourishing. Maybe it was a situational thing where we developed anxiety for a period and we're absolutely fine now. Or maybe we've been diagnosed with an illness which might last quite a long time, but we've learned how to live with that effectively. We all know mental health, mental illness doesn't come entirely from your genes. There isn't one gene that causes mental illness, but there are genes which will predispose us towards developing certain mental illnesses. So anxiety is a great one. You know, my daughter suffers from an anxiety disorder called obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, how did I recognize it? My sister has exactly the same. So there's obviously a genetic component to what my daughter has inherited, unfortunately, from my sister. But, you know, it was triggered during lockdown. Would she have developed OCD if there hadn't been a lockdown? We don't know. But the field of epigenetics suggests that, you know, our genes can get switched on or off by what happens to us, by our environments, by how we look after ourselves. So all of these things can result in poor mental health. Stressful life events. We've been through some of those recently, haven't we? And add to that, you know, for some of us, you know, grief over perhaps potentially losing family members. You know, we have divorce, we have house moves, we have lots of things that can fit into stressful life events in there. Environmental factors, you know, so these might be socioeconomic, for example, or stigma, discrimination. At work, obviously, if we're working in health and safety, we will know that, you know, our work can make a fundamental difference to our well-being, and it might be positive, it might be negative. So, you know, positively, good work is good for us, but negatively, we can end up with stress being caused through our work, can't we? And then we've got things like our psychology or our individual attributes. Is our mindset positive? Are we more glass half empty or glass half full? Are we self-aware? Are we thinking about managing our own happiness? So lots of these things can contribute to poor mental health. Again, this is one you may well have come across, but I'm going to mention it here because it just creates that story. So this is the Yerkes-Dodson stress curve. And what Yerkes-Dodson showed is that a little bit of pressure or challenge is good for us. It gets us motivated. It gets us moving. And we all need some of that. We've all done a job in the past that we can do standing on our heads, and it's not very motivating, is it? Where we aim to be is at that point of optimal arousal and optimal performance. So we've got just the right amount of pressure and challenge for us. We're spinning just the right amount of plates for us. For many of us, that's quite a lot. And it can be quite difficult to notice, actually, I'm now at the top of that curve. I need to be careful because the next thing I take on might tip me over the edge. So we just need to be aware of that and thinking about that, and thinking about, actually, should I delegate that? Should I actually say no? Should I reprioritize? And it's quite difficult sometimes to do that, especially if we enjoy that sensation of plate spinning. If we keep going down that route, taking on more and more and more, we will end up actually with impaired performance because of strong anxiety. So we don't really want to be in that place. So here's a simple way of describing it for you. Pressure or challenge, that's great. That's good for us. That's in green. And then we might end up with stress, mental distress, overwhelm. That's sort of, we're in the amber area. We need to be careful at that point. And then if we keep going down that route, we will end up with burnout, with long-term stress, with physical health issues. Lots of physical health issues are, as you know, caused by chronic stress. Musculoskeletal disorders, often those two coexist. Stomach problems, often caused by stress. Even colds and flu, we're far more likely to catch a cold or the flu if we are actually emotionally not in the best place. So these are all good reasons to look after ourselves. Just let's briefly revisit why we are finding this a real struggle. Our brains are built for survival. They're built for survival. They're not built for happiness. And they weren't built for the kind of world we live in today. They were built for a world where we might have to escape a saber-toothed tiger. So our prehistoric stress response system triggers that flight, fright, or freeze to get us into emergency action. And yes, while some of us are avoiding war or a natural disaster, many of us live in a world where our stress response system is activated by non-emergency situations. You know, think about it. We get out of bed in the morning, our alarm goes off, our child wants something, we've got to rush them out of the door to school. Then we get on a meeting where perhaps it doesn't go very well. Then we're rushing from meeting to meeting. Then we have an incident we have to look at, and then we can't leave on time, and we're worrying about collecting our child or whatever it might be. Our world is built to give us, to put us in that flight, fright, or freeze. And it isn't helpful for us. So we need to find ways of managing that. So first and foremost, let's look at what we do when we feel ourselves running away with stress. So we feel that we're getting our heart rate up, our breathing is getting ragged, perhaps our palms are sweaty. Our brain stops functioning. We're not our best self in those moments. We can't remember those arguments that we were going to make. We can't think logically because that connection with our rational brain is gone. We're in our survival system. So we notice we're in that situation. So what do we do? So the first thing we want to do, ideally, is we want to pause or escape if possible. Just go and take a breath, go outside, take some time away. And then there are two main things that we can do. The first is that we might want to look at our breathing. So we might want to bring regularity and smoothness back to our breath. So that might look like box breathing, where we breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and then hold for 4 again. It might look like something like pursed lip breathing, where we take a shorter in breath and then a long, long out breath, making a sound through pursed lips. But bringing that regularity and smoothness back, focusing on our breath, enables our body to tell our brain it can calm down. We're not under threat of survival. It's a really powerful message. Now, the other thing we can do is move. We can actually get up, we can do some star jumps, we can go on a trampoline if we've got one, we can go for a run, we can move our body, because changing our state will also help our body to tell our brain it's okay, you can calm down. Then we can focus on the present moment. Right now, I'm okay. I've got a roof over my head, I've got work in, I've got people that love me, whatever that might look like. Focus on the present moment, because worry is always about future-based uncertainty or something we did in the past that we're not happy about. It's very rarely, it's not about the present moment, really. So focusing on the present moment. And then re-engaging our rational brain by thinking about labeling that emotion. So we might label that emotion, I am feeling rage, I'm feeling frustrated, I'm feeling angry, or it might be disgust or something like that. But let's try and find the word to describe what we're feeling exactly. That re-engages our prefrontal cortex and enables us then to think, okay, what's behind that? Why do I feel like that? What can I do about that? And then we can take perspective. Will this really matter in 6 months' time? Is this really a life or death situation? Have I interpreted this correctly, or could there be another way of interpreting this? I'm going to introduce you to another theory which you might not have heard of, called Lazarus's theory of stress. And I really like Lazarus's theory of stress. I think it's a really powerful way of relating to stress. So what Lazarus said is, it isn't the stressor itself, it's our thoughts about the stressor. What do I mean by that? So one day you get given a project, and it's actually quite a nice project. You're quite excited about it, really. It's quite interesting. And you've actually got things sort of under control at the time. You know, you've got sort of works in good place. You know, everything's going on well with your family. You've had a good night's sleep. You've been eating well. Maybe you've done your exercise recently. You're in a good place. 2 weeks later, imagine yourself in a different situation, getting that same project. You've had a bad night's sleep. You've had a row with your partner. There's all sorts of things going on with your kids. You've got elderly parents that need help. You don't really have an effective team to delegate to because they're all busy. Do you think that you regard that stressor, that project, in the same way 2 weeks later than you regarded it 2 weeks ago? The stressor, the project, hasn't changed. It's still a project. It's still a stressor. Whether we find it stressful or not depends on what sort of state of mind we're in. Now, why I think this is a really powerful theory is a few things. Number one is that it shows that every single one of us is different on any given day of the week. So, what I find stressful, you might not find stressful. I might be able to deal with 10 things, you might be able to deal with 100. We're all different. So every single person is different on any day of the week. Secondly, it shows us that it's almost like a mini business case for looking after ourselves, because we can improve our ability to deal with stressors by exercising good self-care. If we've had a good night's sleep, if we've eaten the right stuff, if we've got people around us we're making an effort to connect with, if we haven't drunk too much the night before, if we're thinking about our own well-being, we can handle many more stressors than we can when we don't. So it's like a little business case there for looking after ourselves better. And finally, we are human beings who have a rational brain. We can think about that situation, reappraise it, and look at it logically. So actually, yes, that project feels stressful right now, but if I write a list of everything I've got to do, I can go to whoever's given it to me, I can discuss what my priorities are, I can basically decide when to do it, I can help get this person to help me. We have that capacity. So that's a really interesting way of looking at stress, I think, is that it's our thoughts about the stressor, not the stressor itself. A researcher on emotions called Lisa Feldman Barrett has come up with this idea of something called body budget. So what she says is that our adaptive systems are all in play to try to manage the stressors that we are dealing with today. And that has a certain amount of capacity. But beyond that, over time, when we're constantly operating in a stressful environment, our brain's ability to function properly gets worn down. Our adaptive systems stop really protecting us from the stress that we're under. If we add lack of sleep in, we lose memory function as well. And we know that if our body budget comes under severe stress for a long period of time, burnout, anxiety, physical health issues, and ultimately depression may come as a result of chronic stress. We're hearing a lot about this phrase burnout at the moment, and it's not surprising because, as you know, during the pandemic, some people were furloughed, some people didn't have work, and then others were absolutely operating at top speed. If we think about, in the UK, nurses, for example, and I imagine that's very similar wherever you are in the world, even health and safety professionals were really operating at full tilt throughout the pandemic. And we haven't really stopped. We're having to think about things differently all the time. And it's being seen as a real risk for lots of organizations, this idea that people are burning out. So what is burnout? Well, it was a condition that was identified by the World Health Organization in 2020 actually, as the state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion. And it's basically related to occupational stress. So it isn't when you feel overwhelmed because you're having a relationship issue. It's when you feel overwhelmed because of work, that it's entirely related. The term burnout is entirely related to work. So it is a risk right now. And it really is just chronic stress that's occurring in the system. It's not when you go to the doctor and you think, I think I might be burnt out. It's not like anxiety, where there's a very clear sort of methodology for actually triaging you and saying, yes, you have moderate, mild, or severe anxiety. In that case, you would be completing the Goldberg anxiety scale. For the doctors, it's not quite as well defined as that. But the main way of defining it is by using something called the Maslach burnout inventory. And what the Maslach burnout inventory looks at is feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion. And then increased mental distance or cynicism about your job. So if you've always loved your job, if you feel like it's been your passion, and then all of a sudden you think, what's the point? This is really not, I'm not really making any difference here. I'm feeling very cynical about your job. You may want to consider that burnout might be on the horizon for you. You're also going to be reducing in your professional efficacy as well. So now that's all the negative side. So I've just filled you in on all the things that may result from our not looking after ourselves properly. So now let's look at how we protect ourselves against this. And the first thing we're going to look at is this idea that if we have a body budget, we have a certain amount of capacity to deal with a certain amount of stress. One of the things that we can do is top that capacity up. So every time we get 7 to 9 hours sleep a night, for example, every time we go to the gym, every time we connect with our family, every time we rest, we're topping up our body budget. We're topping up our ability to deal with tomorrow's stressors. This is our 5 pillars of well-being. It's not everything, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it is the key things to have a think about and to look at when you're struggling. And it's often the first things to go out of the window when we are struggling with our health. So firstly, we're looking at nutrition. We know that there is an increased understanding of the connection between our gut and our brain. So we know that, eating a wide range of fruit and vegetables, eating potentially fermented food, all of that will increase our mental health. Exercise, we know that between 10 minutes and half an hour a day will make an enormous difference to us. Sleep, the unsung hero of well-being. Most of us, apart from about 0.4% of the population, need 7 to 9 hours sleep. If you're not getting that, that's a real area to focus on. Rest and relaxation. In our society today, we do not get enough rest and relaxation. So one of the things to think about is something called active rest, where we're focusing on something that we really enjoy, which isn't work, but where we're having to actually wholly focus on that thing. So it might be riding or creating something or playing a musical instrument or singing, something where we're fully engaged in that activity. And then we have managing our thinking. What does that mean? So for me, what that means is understanding my thoughts are not the truth. So that thought I had that, oh, everything's rubbish, or, oh, that person really doesn't like me, or it's all going terribly at the moment. Those are just thoughts. They're words I say to myself. They're not the truth. We are interpretation making machines as human beings. So if we think about actually what has happened, we are then creating an interpretation around that. So say somebody gives you a funny look. You could interpret that as, oh, they're having a bad day, or they didn't have enough sleep, or they're confused. Or you could interpret that as, they hate me, they think I'm talking rubbish. And with our negativity bias that comes from us as human beings, we're probably more likely to focus in on those things that make us feel worse rather than make us feel better. So that's managing our thinking. When it comes to managing stress, because we are in a world where our stress response system is being activated all the time, and actually it shouldn't be really, we need to think about closing that off regularly. And those things that I mentioned in the last slide are all good ways of topping our body budget up, but specific ways of our body telling our brain it's okay, your stress response can stop, you're doing all right. the main research shows that exercise has the strongest evidence behind it of being that way that enables us to tell our brain to calm down. So exercise, breathing, might be meditation, might be yoga, something that brings us back to our breath. Somebody mentioned earlier on positive social interaction, so being with friends and family, they also make a difference, especially if that involves laughing with people. Crying also helps. Active rest, we just talked about, for example, singing or horse riding or sport or something that engages you entirely. Being outdoors in nature, sleeping. And then there is some evidence also for cold water being helpful. If you like open water swimming, I don't know if anybody on here likes that. Pop it in the chat box if you do. Open water swimming or a cold shower. I've had no heating for 3 months. I've been forced to adopt the cold showers. I'm not sure how good it is, but ultimately I suppose it might be being helpful. I don't know. Or grounding, that might mean walking with bare feet on the sand or on the earth. There is some evidence for those being things which help to close off the stress cycle too. This one, oh, somebody's put something in the chat box. Is that somebody that likes cold water swimming? Oh, running in the rain. Fantastic. Oh, yes, I can relate to that. That is quite exciting, isn't it? Yeah, running in the rain. Thank you, Louisa. This one I run through on every single course because it is so helpful for getting our thinking into shape. So once we understand that our stress is getting out of control, we need to really sit down with a piece of paper. First of all, we're going to write all those stressors down. Then we're going to think about which of those things or what inherent in that thing is in my control. What is outside of my control completely, and what can I influence? As human beings, we spend a lot of time in the circle of concern, which are those things which we can do nothing about. We spend a lot of time and energy worrying, complaining, talking to other people about those things which we can't do anything about fundamentally. It's a waste of time and a waste of energy. Where we are better to focus is, what about that thing can I influence? What about that thing can I control? Oh, I've got some couple more chat messages come in here. I'm just going to have a look at those. Oh, a cold water on the foot and the leg helps with the blood circulation and has a calming effect. That's really interesting. I haven't tried that, Cecile. I'll have to try that. Oh, you did Anne did a Wim Hof ice bath experience last weekend. The breathing exercises were amazing and transformational. Anne, I must try that out. That sounds brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's really interesting. Right, so let's go back to this. Now, you think about one stressor that you have that you think, oh, I'm worrying about all this all the time. Plot it on the influence, control, and concern. I'm going to give you my example whilst you're thinking about yours. So my example, I shared earlier, my daughter has obsessive compulsive disorder. Let me tell you, it is not easy to live with. The floor gets flooded regularly where she washes her hands too vigorously. Her bedroom is apparently a safe place where she can't put anything contaminated. Hence, all her clothes sit in the corridor outside. Not easy. She slept on the sofa for weeks at a time earlier this year because she couldn't go in her bedroom. I have to do almost everything for her. She can't pick anything up off the floor. So it's a bit wearing, shall we say. And I really got very stressed about it. I would get really angry. I'd get shouty. I'd like, the house is gonna fall down with all the water that you're drowning the floor in. I'd get really irate. And actually, a few months ago, I kind of got my head around it. So the way I look at it now is this. I cannot control the fact that my daughter has OCD. I can't control the progress of that OCD. I can't control whether she's going to be well with it, whether she's going to be able to live independently. I can't control it. It's completely outside of my control. So I will not spend time in that domain. However, I can influence. I can influence by getting her a good therapist, which I've done. I can influence by helping her to work on what makes her happy. So I ensure she does lots of horse riding because horse riding makes her happy. I've made sure she's gone to a great college where she's got some friends, and I spend time with her, talking to her and things like that. That is in my influence. Now I'm interested, please pop in the chat box, what is in my control when it comes to my daughter? So anybody who can have any thoughts about what actually is in my control, I'd be really interested to hear from you. Let's see if anybody's going to send anything in the chat box there. We've got one. Okay. Oh, we've got three. Right. Being present. Brilliant, Louisa. Absolutely. Thank you. Your response to her actions and how you speak to her. Exactly right. I can only fundamentally control my reaction to what she does. So I now, when she floods the floor, I just go behind her with a mop and say, there you go. Anything I can do? And I speak to her much more kindly than I did. And that has actually had a massive effect on her and has made her happier and less stressed. So it's a virtuous circle. So if you think about your stressor, whatever it might be finances, it might be somebody's health, it might be your own health, think might be your work, might be workload. Think about, what can I control? What can I influence? And what do I need to reframe? So, for example, this will pass, or this might be a learning opportunity, or for me, this might be something I can talk about in my webinars. You know, who knows? But think about that for your stressor. It's such a great tool. It comes from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but he stole it from the Stoics. The Stoics said, if you can't control it, you shouldn't worry about it. It's easier said than done. So he added that really nice in the middle circle of influence, which I really like. As you know from Louise's introduction, I'm studying applied positive psychology. So positive psychology is a new science, and it's a science based on looking at interventions that people can make in their lives to make them happier. So it studies subjective well-being, it studies how happy people feel, and it studies which are the most effective of these interventions. And whilst I'm talking about these, I'd like to focus on gratitude, because gratitude is, to me, the most fantastic tool. It brings us back out of our heads when we are catastrophizing about what's going to happen in the future, or what this means, or what that means. It enables us to focus on the now. So if anybody's prepared to share 1 or 2 things they're grateful for in their life right now, pop it in the chat box. But gratitude, if we can think regularly about what we're grateful for, we literally start to notice more things to be grateful for, and we actually just feel happier. So it's such a massive shortcut to embracing our current circumstances and just feeling happier. So we've got 1 in the chat box. Thank you for that. Good health. That's a brilliant one to feel grateful for. Thank you, Naomi, for sharing that. Family. We've got family, roof over our heads. Yes. How often do we get stuck in the melodrama and not get present to what we have? Having a stable home and a job. Brilliant, Anne. Thank you. All of these and many more are being studied in the science of applied positive psychology. So we know that gratitude makes the difference. We know that savoring, thinking about really focusing in on that moment. So the other day I was sat with my dog and my daughter, and we had a log fire on because we got no heating. And I just felt like, wow, aren't I lucky? This is an amazing moment. I've got my lovely daughter with me. I've got my dog curled up with me. I've got a log fire. This is lovely. And the more we can savor, the more positive emotion we feel, the greater our resilience is, the happier we feel. We've got spirituality there, which one of you mentioned that your relationship with God was very important to you. We've got mindfulness. If anybody practices meditation or mindfulness, you'll know that bringing ourselves back to the breath regularly is a really, really good thing to do. Right, we've got some more here. I have to read these out. So Louise is grateful for networks. Yes, I'm grateful for you, Louise, too. Friends, seeing each other again after the pandemic. Yes. Louisa is happy that her children are happy at school, Health, obvious, but with close friends, poorly, it brings it home. It does, doesn't it? Yes. And Cecile is grateful for knowing I'm loved by my husband, friends, and family. That's lovely, Cecile. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing those things. Now, I always advocate knowing yourself fundamentally. So we know that no recipe for happiness is the same from individual to individual. So we know that we need to understand ourselves, what makes us happy. But also, let's understand ourselves and what might predispose us to getting stressed or to potentially succumbing to burnout. Now, burnout is, as I said earlier, an occupational condition. So generally what we do is we look at the workplace. We look at what in this workplace is causing stress. But if we go back to that center of control, influence, and concern, we can probably only influence our workplace. Whereas when it comes to ourselves, we have more control. So let's look at some of the risk factors for us as individuals, which might cause us to burn out, just to be present to these things in ourselves. And when we're aware, once that awareness comes up, we have more capacity to make some choices. So firstly, there's perfectionism. We're going to look in the next slide at perfectionism, because for me, we've got an epidemic of perfectionism, and it's something to really be aware of in ourselves. Is your self-esteem highly linked to your work? It always was with me. I've got so much better now. But, you know, when I met somebody for the first time, it would always be, what job do you do? What job do you do? Now it's far less important to me what jobs people do, but it was, my self-esteem was very much linked to my work. Are you a people pleaser? Do you hate to say no to anyone? Certainly that's one that I've struggled with. And do you feel you have little or no control over your work? These are the things that are going to be risk factors for you as individuals. Let's have a look at this perfectionism. This was a bit of a revelation to me, because it wasn't until 3 or 4 years ago, and remember, I'm in my 50s, that I realized I was a perfectionist. Because for me, perfectionism was being neat and tidy, having to have everything perfect before you started. So for me, people that were perfectionists were quite slow, they procrastinated. Not necessarily. So Frost and Hewitt are the primary researchers on perfectionism, and they see that there are 3 types of perfectionism. Number 1 is called self-oriented. So think about this. Does it make you uneasy to see an error you've made? Do you think you need to work to your full potential at all times? Do you set high standards for yourself? If all of those are relevant to you, you may be self-oriented perfectionist. I know I am, in spades. Then we've got other-oriented perfectionism. Do you struggle when people close to you make mistakes, or when they do something less than perfectly? Do you dislike people who won't strive to better themselves? Absolutely. That's other prescribed perfectionism. So is that you? And then the final one is socially prescribed perfectionism. Do you find it difficult to meet others' expectations of you? Do the people around you expect you to succeed at everything? That's less so for me. But the first 2, oh my goodness me, I think I scored 99% and 98%. Now, we can be successful when we're perfectionists, right? However, it's a very stressful environment to be in, and it's also stressful for those around us. If they know when they make a mistake, we're going to be stressed about it. That isn't very healthy, is it? So recognizing that is you will actually potentially give you some self-awareness around that. So now my immediate thing is, when I make a mistake, my immediate thing is, I made a mistake. And I can now come back and say, okay, it's all right. You're doing your best. It's only a small mistake. Doesn't really matter. Whereas in the past, I would have thought about that for days on end and really got upset about it. Let's see, we've got a chat message here. So let's have a look at what somebody said in the chat box. Oh, Louise, you do too. Brilliant. I'm glad I'm not alone. So the antidote to perfectionism is self-compassion. Self-compassion looks at speaking to ourselves nicely, for a start. So when we have made a mistake, or when we don't feel we've done our best, do we think about oh, you're rubbish, you're hopeless, you're useless? Do we talk to ourselves in a way that we wouldn't talk to our worst enemy? Certainly not to our best friend, probably. So let's change some of our words. Let's think about, you did your best. Doesn't matter, you've learned something. Or, look, they'll understand, it's fine. Talk to yourself as if you were your best friend rather than your worst enemy. That's the start of self-compassion. If you want to know more about self-compassion, I recommend looking at Kirsten Neff. I did a whole workbook of hers during the pandemic because I think I really needed some self-compassion. So she's great. And yes, Tamara says, think some of those can be healthiest if you take it to an obsessive level. It's two sides of the same coin. Our strengths and our weaknesses are two sides of the same coin. So doing things really well is helpful. But if you do things really well and it's a winning formula, which you try and try and you're really fixated on, it becomes a weakness too, doesn't it? So as you say, Tamara, it's not being obsessive about it, is it? It's trying to do a good job, but actually knowing that sometimes it's just good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's good enough. So there we go. Now, let's look at something that somebody mentioned earlier on, which is the idea that friends and family are really important. Resilience, which is defined as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, and significant sources of stress, doesn't mean that we won't experience difficulty or distress. In fact, the road to resilience may involve considerable emotional distress because we actually get more resilient when we go through things and we come out the other side of those things, don't we? Anne Marston is the key researcher on resilience, and she says that supportive relationships are the key to resilience. So actually nurturing those supportive relationships, making sure that we check in with those people that are really in our tribe and are on our side, and those people that are non-judgmental and will listen to us in a kind way, those are the people that we need to really treasure and value. And then let's think about this idea of balance. Now, not all of these are going to be absolutely in balance at any one time, but how often do we prioritize our work at the expense of everything else in our lives? Or, we very rarely prioritize our hobbies that way, do we? But, it's just one aspect of us. It's one aspect of our lives, isn't it? I know my dad died last year and my mum died the year before, and the year that my dad was significantly ill, he had Alzheimer's and he was in a care home near me, and I went to visit him 4 times a week. And in the past, that would have been for me unthinkable to miss that amount of work. But for me, I look back and I think that was the most important thing that I could have done in that period. And actually, when I think about what I'm proudest of, that's one of the things I'm proudest of. It's not my work. It's the fact that I was there for my dad when he needed me at the end of his life. And we all have, relationships are so important to us. And often we don't prioritize those because we feel we have to do more work. So just doing a little audit regularly of where we are with these things and trying to bring them back, bring some balance in, is important. I love this that Oliver Burkeman said. Oliver Burkeman is a writer on happiness, and he said, there will always be too much to do. And that realization is liberating. The only viable solution is to make a shift from a life spent trying not to neglect anything to one in which we proactively and consciously choose what not to do in favor of what matters most. So really take that in. There will always be too much to do. Working on what we're not going to do because we are going to focus on those things that matter most is really important. We've only got one life. It can be tough at times. We need to proactively think about our own well-being and plan things in. Think about what makes us happy. We need to think about being self-aware and understanding what makes us tick. And then human connection is so important. Asking our colleagues how they are, reaching out to other people when we're struggling. These are the things which make life rich, where we can support each other. This is us. If you're interested in knowing more, please drop me an email, heather@healthy Actually, it's healthy-working.com. That's incorrect. Apologies for that. But Heather at healthy-working.com. So we focus on working with safety professionals, with senior teams, with middle managers, and with your employees. So it'd be great to hear from you if anybody would like to. I've got lots of little chat coming in. Right, so we've got yeah, for me, it relates to the pillars of well-being. I love to exercise and eat well, feel good, but sometimes so busy, just have to survive. I've learned to have self-compassion, to be kind to myself and roll with it if a survival and not a thriving week. Louisa, I couldn't agree with you more. You know, there's so much pressure on us in society to be happy and to thrive all of the time. And actually, sometimes life is just about getting through, isn't it? And we might look back and say we've learned something from it, but it's not necessarily pleasant at the time. So I think that's a really great point you've made there. So Tamara says, key for myself is if something is not working, can I snap, stop now and plan? Oh, that's lovely. I love that, Tamara. That's really good. Self-care is very important. Often I know I don't prioritize it. Right. Christine in LinkedIn, she said she would strive to be the best as a badge of honor. Once the goal was met, then move right on to what next. She realized this is hurting her in so many ways. Christine, you're a sister. I'm exactly the same. It's never enough. It's never enough. And I have to manage that in my own brain, because otherwise your achievements don't make you happy, do they? And Tamara says, what we've got, so just a page down here, it's important to celebrate your wins. It is, Tamara. That's all I've got to say. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending today. I'm just going to pop my email address in the chat box there. If anybody wants to connect with me, that would be great. But anyone got any questions, any comments? Be very happy to hear from you.
That was amazing, Heather. Yeah, no, I was going to say is we haven't necessarily, if anybody does have any questions, I am monitoring the LinkedIn and the chat. So if there are any more questions for Heather, we do still have some time to pose those questions. I have a question, Heather. So within the organisations that you go into, and you've obviously worked with a wide range of different kind of organisations, are there sort of are there, say, 3 top things that an organization or a company can do to really sort of get the ball rolling in those? And where would they start, and what would be perhaps those top 3 things?
So I would say that often organizations start bottom up rather than up down, and that's fine. It doesn't matter where you start, as long as you do involve your senior team at some point in the process, because addressing well-being in an organization, if you think that you can't involve your senior team in that, you're not really addressing well-being, because a lot of the issues that organizations have are systemic. And the biggest issue in workplaces today is simply too much work. So how do we get organizations to actually look at, how much slack they have in the system, how they help prioritize things, looking at working time in contracts, for example. Many people in the UK, they just sign away the right to the working time directive applying to them, don't they? So senior leaders have to buy in, really. But let's start with, some general mental health awareness for everybody. And then the second thing that I would do is train your managers, because your managers have the biggest impact on your well-being at work. They're the gatekeeper for your stress, effectively. And if you can create a team of managers that create psychologically safe environments where people can say, I'm struggling, I can't cope, or I've got too much on, can we have a chat about it? You will be doing such a good job. So managers, for me, is the one area that organizations really should focus on first and foremost. And then obviously there's the board, and then general mental health awareness for everybody.
Yeah, and one of the things that I often say to people is, which I've been doing this week actually, is looking at everything that you do within an organization and saying, actually, is there something that we're doing here that we can stop doing? Because I think sometimes particularly when organizations go through transformation, they add and add and add and add without stepping back and saying, well, actually, do we really need to be doing this thing over here that we're doing.
I agree, and that's on the macro level and on the micro level. So as individuals, I remember really well when I was running a business at UBM, and I had quite a big team, and I'd have people who were still sending me reports I'd asked for 2 years ago that I didn't look at anymore. I just didn't need that anymore, but they just keep churning them out. So, when you've got too much on, go to your manager and say, look, I'm still doing this thing. Do you still need it? So, adult to adult communication often gets lost in organizations, doesn't it? And we sort of turn into these children where I've got to do everything I've been asked to do, whereas actually there's only so many hours in the day. I'm being paid for those hours, so what do you want me to fit in? My hourly rate is X. Is it worth my time to do that, or should you give it to somebody else? It's just trying to look at it from an adult to adult perspective as well.
The phrase that has just come to mind is the opposite of complexity is not simplicity, it's reductionism.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Just came.
Well, yes,
I've used that in some of the leading safety stuff that I do, but yeah, it's thinking about how we can, and I think this big data world that we live in, where everything's monitored, probably adds to that. And would you say that there's something around that and leadership styles?
What do you mean by big data?
So big data impact, where we literally can monitor anything and everything's at a touch of a button. Does that, where we can monitor it all and where we can respond to data, do you think that that's leading to greater stress within our organization?
I don't know, actually. That's an interesting point. I don't know. For me, the great stress risk factors when we go round are two. There's just too much work, and managers are not necessarily very good. So, I mean, some managers are great, they're showing empathy and emotional intelligence, and some they're just not. They were recruited for their technical competence and they haven't gained those additional skills, and they actually add stress. So those are two that I notice in most organizations that cause stress.
And yeah, and I think it's that challenge, isn't it? So those people that have reached the top of those organizations might have learned to do so in a very different, certainly pre-pandemic, we were in a different world. So it's how you can engage those people in a leadership position, and it's understand, because I think people think, if I'm talking to somebody, if I'm nurturing them, am I still going to get the work done?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I'm working with because I work with quite sort of hazardous heavy industries sometimes, and actually a lot of those are very performance driven, and actually what we're trying to do is say, well, actually let's not lose that focus on performance, but let's build in the fact that if you're looking after people properly, if you're talking to them nicely, if you're showing empathy and emotional intelligence, you'll actually get greater performance out of them in the long run.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Heather.
Thank you for asking me.
And thank you for joining us at OneWISH. We haven't got any more questions for you, which is great. I'm gonna, if there's no more questions for Heather, I'm gonna ask you, Heather, to say thank you very much. Please do stay on. I'm gonna just do a closer. So that kind of brings us to the end of our sessions for today. So I'm just going to close off. And I'd just like to say a really massive thank you to the OneWISH crew, who have absolutely pulled all of this together, and pulled together industry leaders across the psych health and safety field from around the world. And it's been fantastic this week to really venture across the time zones as we've done so. We've been able to stream everything live on LinkedIn and YouTube, and you will find all of the sessions will be there and accessible following today's event, and also via our website. A really massive thank you to the whole of the OneWISH crew for making this all happen. Thank you to everybody who supports us, everybody who's volunteering for us, Melissa, Malcolm, Tamara, Louisa and Liz, who are part of the internal crew who's working behind the scenes. It's Liz's last day today, and thank you so much for everything that you've done for us, Liz. It's been great. And if you heard Malcolm's opener at the beginning of our week this week, you will know that OneWISH is all about supporting women and underrepresented groups and bringing them into the health and safety profession and leadership and influential positions. You know, around the world, we have a richly diverse workforce, and we can only serve within our organisations when we complement this diversity. During the pandemic, we all were connected with business like never before, and now is our time as a health and safety profession to demonstrate the value we will bring when we have the ability to bring our whole selves to the workplace. Thank you to Malcolm, who I can see is on the line again now, for your opener and for your honesty and your personal perspectives on how this fits into our roles as health and safety professionals. But really at the very heart of this is compassion and creating work where individuals can speak up when they feel unsafe, when they see something unsafe, or when the person next to them feels the same. Melissa introduced a great keynote speech from Dr. David Daniels, who was talking to us from stateside about how it feels when we are excluded at work and why this is such a crucial piece for organisations to consider in their mental health strategies. And he was quite pointed when he said, if someone says at work that they don't feel psychologically safe, believe them and do something with it. Thank you to Lame Ter for your insights into how we need to focus on the middle to create inclusive pipelines into leadership. And if you're a leader in an within an underrepresented group, it doesn't matter who you are or where you are someone's role model. So get out there, be active. If you can see it, you can be, if you can see it, you can be it. Rosa Carrillo gave us a great talk about building trust and offered some simple tips for leaders to connect with their people on a very personal level. We talked about the mental health of health and safety professionals. And we also talked about which groups were most likely to suffer with their mental health post-pandemic. And we talked about how women in particular, because of the nature of their roles and the unpaid work that they take on beyond this, are definitely at the top of that list. And she played and certainly this really stuck out for me. She played an excellent clip demonstrating how psychological harm will trigger the same pain receptors in the brain as if we've had a physical injury. So much so that if we take a painkiller, it helps, which amazed me. So watch that clip and do catch up on her session. We then went from Rosa in the west coast of the USA in California across to Australia the next morning with Joelle Mitchell. Melissa hosted a great conversation with Joelle, Peter Kelly and myself, where we discussed ISO 45003. We talked about how this really can help organisations of all sizes anywhere, and we discussed what different territories are doing around the world in respect of psych safety. There were some really great hints and tips for using the standard, which at its core has the plan, do, check, act approach. Joelle gave an excellent overview of various terms that we hear and that we're using, and in particular around, you know, what is the difference when we talk about psychological health and safety and psychosocial risk. And also, I would urge you to check out, link in with Joelle and all of our speakers. But Joelle can give you access to free training resources if you're working on this within your organisation. So that brings us up to today, and Karen McDonnell hosted a panel session with Anne Diment, Catherine Coleman, Belinda Nyaba, Nikki Amiaka, and Danielle Paulino. And we discussed and talked about the programs that we're running with ROSPA and L'Oreal's Safe at Work, Safe at Home partnership, promoting and offering training and mentorship for women around the world to support them into leadership roles. And some of those women came on the session, and we talked about how we can increase visibility, accessibility, and moving between different roles. And in the panel, we talked about the support, and I think this came out in Heather's session just now, is this the support that these types of networks can provide and bring to one another, and how we can share with each other. So, and I think one of the other keys for me with that was, let's be open. Ask if someone's okay, and if you don't quite get a response, ask them a second time. And I also loved the message from this session that we're all good enough, everyone. Malcolm dropped in and commented about how he sees the pressures that, you know, certainly we face pressure as women at work, and he's seen personally how there seems to be, we need to have an additional layer of resilience to really fight to be heard in the same kind of way. It's okay to be our true selves and consider how the pressure from outside can impact on what we do. And really, you know, and Karen spoke very much of how, you know, this is part of the campaign from ROSPA about whole people and their whole life initiative. And we've just heard from the brilliant Heather Beach, who closed our events for the week today, looking at how to manage stress and burnout in a changing world. And Heather talked about how we can become more self-aware, how we can think about our own mental health and how we are influenced. We know some pressure and challenge is good, but when it goes too far, we all need to consider and learn to say no, prioritize, or delegate. Heather and Rosa earlier on in the week both talked about how we can use breathing techniques to create calm. Let's move and exercise and focus on the moment. Recognize how you're feeling and think about why it's there, and to take perspective. Consider how we think, and our thoughts are not necessarily the truth. Consider our positive emotions and consider gratitude. And how we have dealt, certainly in, you know, deal with perfectionism. And I think that's something I personally face and others do as well. So just as I close, I did want to share some insights that I've considered in all of this, and what for me is a core foundation. As I so often say, we can have the best risk assessments, we can have the best rules, arrangements, processes within our organisations, but if our workers and those people that are working around us don't feel psychologically safe, if inherently the workplace is unhealthy, there will be no trust. Conversely, good work is good for us, and we can all contribute to those positive initiatives that we've talked about this week. At the very heart of all of this is relationships, and the relationships that we have with one another. It's about how we communicate. I'm just going to share some slides that I shared recently around some of this, and I've called it There's some really clever brain stuff. And I think when we talk about psychological health and safety, as so many of our speakers have mentioned, it's thinking about how we all think differently. So we could be very similar individuals, but actually we will perceive issues and situations in a very, very different way. And all of that has been influenced by who we are and what we do. And I think Heather mentioned that in her session, is that our thoughts may not be the truth. So I recently shared this diagram, which I find fascinating, and it's how all of us can think and perceive differently, and how, you know, we have a different brain science going on depending on who we are. And for me, this really relates to what we do in terms of health and safety. So, and I'd urge you to have a look at this. So Google it, it's quite interesting. So if you're a predominantly left hemisphere type person, you'll be very technical, very process driven. You will look at things very much on a task by task basis, which kind of rings true as us as health and safety professionals. On the right hand hemisphere, we've got creativity and movement and fluidity. And so the challenge in all that we do is thinking about, you know, which side of my brain, which side of my hemisphere am I engaging here, and building that kind of fluidity around all that we are doing and how we do. And when we really start to do that, we start to move forward, we start to become more creative, we start to consider different aspects of that we perhaps hadn't considered before. And we are in a changing world where the only constant is change. So how we adapt to that and how we move forward in a psychologically safe environment is absolutely critical. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. So absolutely how we do that is so important. Sorry, I've lost my way. So please do stay close to OneWISH. Our next event is going to be in March, and this will coincide with International Women's Day, where the theme will be Embrace Equality. If you do have a suggestion for a speaker, or you feel that you can support us in any way, please do have a look at our website and reach out. If you'd like to be part of our community, if you'd like to support our work or offer sponsorship, we're always looking for volunteers. At the heart of everything that we do, we believe that we are so much stronger together. We really can only deal with the complex challenges in the world today when we care, show compassion, and adapt. Great things are rarely achieved by one person. Engaged teams can achieve amazing things. Diverse teams can achieve extraordinary things, but our global teams really can change the world, and it only takes one conversation at a time. And as my OneWISH co-founder would say, be like the hummingbird. Thank you so much for supporting our event over the last week. Thank you and goodbye.